as an investigator, you should go into the location and you should, prior to the investigation, you should kind of do like a baseline.
Okay.
So if you're walking into a building, it shouldn't be for the first time. It should be at least somewhat familiar. So you have an idea of what has changed. So the first thing is it should be somewhat familiar to you. And as a writer, you should be able to express that, like with saying things like, as the last time he was here, it felt like this. So when you're walking into it, like to me, I don't do the dark, turn off all the lights thing because that's a party favor kind of. That's a product. That's production value, I guess, is
Uh-huh.
to get the green. So you're gonna take into account what it was like the first time you've been there, and then as you go through there, you're going to almost have to go into a state of like hypervigilance.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vickie Lan, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Daniel Bautz, thank you so much for joining me today for Speculative Sandbox. I am really excited about today's topic. But first, how about you introduce yourself and tell our listeners about what you do?
Well, thanks, Vickie, for having me on. I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk to the listeners of Speculative Sandbox. I'm a writer. I've had my debut novel out, Life is in the Blood. It came out in February, and it's available on Amazon. And that's pretty much what I do. I'm not a full-time writer, but that is my primary focus in life.
Gotcha. And when we were chatting before we selected a topic, you had some really interesting experiences and you used to run a podcast. So, podcaster to former podcaster. Can you tell me about that podcast and what was probably the most interesting thing you learned doing that?
So one of the most interesting things I learned by doing the podcast, which was called Grand Arc Conspiracy, and it was focused on fringe topics like ghosts, Bigfoot, outer space, just anything that was kind of not the accepted norm. So what I learned a lot is that people are pretty much the same no matter what their interests are. And that when I went into it, I was trying to see what kind of people were interested in said topics and why they were interested, to see, just where these people are coming from. And they came from all walks of life, which kind of told me that, there really isn't too as many dissimilarities between people as there are similarities. That was like the biggest thing that I learned um, through doing the podcasting, is just talking to all these different people and just realizing that everybody is human and we're all having that same human experience.
That's a really great thing to learn. You talked a little bit about the specific topic that you used to cover a lot, which was paranormal investigations. And when you looked at my list for topic ideas, what I like to focus on is pulling from industry experts so that fellow writers can kind of get inside your brain and understand the world building and character development for whatever it is that they happen to be writing. And on that list of careers and experiences that I kind of wanted to pull was paranormal investigations. And you wrote me and you said you have experience with that. So can you tell me a little bit about your background there?
So my background there is I have always been interested in the odd things that happen in the world, whether they're ghosts or whatever. So the exploration started pretty early for me into those topics. But like once we had this kind of bloom of paranormal investigation through the proliferation of podcasts and also televised programming about the topic, I started to see how these methods uh, for investigation were set up. I and another friend started moonlighting, going through graveyards and things like that to try and capture any kind of, I want to say, quote, evidence, unquote, that we could, to kind of show that this type of material was out there and able to be captured. And so from there, I mean, I never lost interest in the topic. I'm still interested in the topic, but from there, we did that for a short while, and then I started into the podcast, and then it kind of the exploration went from being practically like in locations then to talking to people who were also engaged in that. So the exploration just kind of shifted from physically investigating to almost like looking at it from a sociological and anthropological viewpoint of who and why are the people doing the investigation.
Interesting. So then
So that's
here's
my
a fun icebreaker. If you were a ghost, how would you choose to haunt people?
I'd probably just move their keys around. You know,
Be an
make their
annoying
lives.
ghost?
I would be an annoying ghost. I wouldn't be too nefarious, but I would like to have fun, shut off the TV or switch the channels on and that kind of thing.
Make someone go a little crazy. They're like, I could have sworn I put my things there and now it's in the
Right.
fridge.
Right. Absolutely.
What kind of circumstances call for a paranormal investigation?
So that's a good question. I think it really comes down to the individual's experience. And I think that's one of the discoveries that I made, that all of this comes down to the individual and the experiences they're having. So if you're scared to be in a location because you believe that there's a haunting going on, that warrants an investigation. If you know, you're experiencing some kind of uh, more physical manifestations, when when I say that, I'm thinking like scratches or things like that, that warrants an investigation. But I don't think it's the same type of people you need to bring in for each of those investigations. So like if you just want to know what's going on, I mean, you can do the investigation yourself, which I know a lot of people say you shouldn't, but you need answers. You're looking for answers. So that's that is when an investigation, I think, is warranted.
Was there ever a call or a message that you received that kind of freaked you out a little bit just reading what they were going through?
No, because of my own personal experiences, kind of seem to make a lot of what other people are going through not so like scary or daunting. So when I mean, doesn't matter what I would get. It just, you know, I felt like if I'm going to do something or someone reached out to me, that I need to come in calm and even handed and not inflate the situation, and not alarm. So to me, it wasn't anything that super alarmed me. I know I did do a preliminary investigation for a lay religious demonologist who had someone contact them, and that was a very interesting situation because I it was well outside my purview.
Demon work is outside of your
So
purview? Is that what it is? Demon
well,
work?
yeah, well, I mean, it's the lay religious demonologist. And there's not a lot of them. He was affiliated with the Catholic Church. I knew him through the podcast. He asked if I would be willing to go out because he lives in the Northeast, and at the time I was living in Ohio, and the people that contacted him were from Ohio. He asked if I would go out and do the preliminary investigation and interview with these people,
Okay.
and I did it, and that was like well outside of what I was used to because it really wasn't so much of me going in and trying to gather evidence of the paranormal as it was to do a psychological profile and like, you know, get some images that would be pertinent to them, kind of ascertaining whether this was a psychological problem or this was anything that kind of was a paranormal problem. So
What
it was
percentage of your investigations would you say, I guess, bridge between actual and psychological?
That's a good question. I think they're all 100% psychological, regardless of whether or not there's a bad actor on the other end. So even if there is activity going on, I still think there's a psychological aspect to it because I think for the most part, I mean, from my opinion, that either this stuff is exceptionally rare or it's unbelievably common, and I kind of fall on the unbelievably common side of it. It's just a matter of how people disseminate information and whether or not they engage in cognitive dissonance when dealing with something that's outside their normal.
Gotcha.
It's kind of like sorry, it's kind of like with Beetlejuice, where it's like most people won't see ghosts. It's almost like a
Okay.
choice.
Interesting. Okay, so then in addition to the demonology experience that you had, what's a range of case types that you would get?
I mean, to me, mostly it was walking around in dark places, and graveyards, and things like that for investigations, or going to purportedly haunted locations to kind of capture evidence. As far as a lot of casework, I didn't really do a lot of person to person casework. So if it were something like that, it would just come in and see if I thought the place was haunted. And usually, I didn't.
Okay.
Usually, it's absolutely not the case. And again, it comes back to that psychological um, bent. I can't dismiss somebody else's experiences, but I also can't always confirm them. So it's like kind of trying to prove a negative. But what you can do is kind of give people information to kind of assuage the fear.
Okay. Like maybe scientific explanations if it's not entirely inside their head?
Well, if it's not entirely inside the head, sometimes it is very like environmental. Like you live in this. The like one of the prime examples is I went to a location and people would smell like cherry pipe smoke. Would just like kind of appear, and they were like, that's a ghost. And then you would go into I went into the location, and that location was very dank and damp. And so one of the things that people don't think about is like wood, and it was very wooden, bare wood on the walls, kind of situation. Wood stores information, and I don't mean like literal information, but like smells. So when it gets damp again, it'll release that smell again. So if someone had been down there for 30 years smoking a cherry pipe or whatever, a cherry
Mm-hmm.
flavor or cherry scented pipe tobacco, that's going to get stored in the environment. And when the conditions are right, it's going to release that back into the environment. So, and that's exactly the conditions that it went in. It was very humid, and so then you could smell the cherry pipe smoke, releasing from that wood. So a lot of it's environmental. A lot of things are stored around us that we don't even think about in the environment. And I'm not talking about like energy. I'm talking about like the particles of the pipe smoke. That goes somewhere. It's stored
Mm-hmm.
somewhere and it gets released back out.
One thing I hear very often is places suddenly get very cold. Were you ever kind of able to figure out a reason for that?
That's definitely a very interesting, and I've experienced that for sure. One of the things that I only think if it's thermodynamics, and I'm doing some research on that right now for the book I'm working on, is it's kind of based around the cold spots thing, which is if you get in cold one place, then it should heat up in a corresponding place. I don't know how far the distance is, so like there's a thermodynamic exchange that happens there. So that is almost like its own way to create like a zero. It's almost like an energy source in and of itself, that change. So I know a lot of people think like when spirits are trying to manifest, they're pulling energy from one place to manifest in another. That's the prevailing theory within the paranormal community. So
Interesting. So
I don't
if
know
you're in a
what.
cold spot, does that mean that in that with that theory that energy was taken from there so the ghost manifests somewhere else, or is the cold spot where they're manifesting?
See, I think a lot of people focus on the cold spot and the latter, but I think that you're more apt to be correct with the former. I think the cold spot is where the energy is being pulled from. That's where the vacuum is created. That's why the temperature drops, and it's using that to potentially manifest in a spot where they've taken that energy to kind of create a way to manifest.
Ooh, so if you're scared, you should just stay in the cold spot because they're not there.
Yeah, right. Most likely, that seems that. I mean, if you're thinking about like the nature of a vacuum, yeah, you're pulling that something out of there, and temperature like dropping is an absence of temperature. That's it's pulling something out of that space to make it cool. That's how like a condenser works on your uh, air conditioning.
Interesting. Okay. So let's get inside your mind a little bit because we may have writers listening that are trying to write about paranormal investigations, but they haven't been on an investigation. So really pulling from your perspective and experience. So let's kind of set the stage a little bit. We are a character that is going to a place that's under investigation. So when you get there, what does it feel like? What does it smell like? What are some of your senses telling you?
Well, see, that's an interesting thing because as an investigator, you should go into the location, and you should prior to the investigation, you should kind of do like a baseline.
Okay.
So if you're walking into a building, it shouldn't be for the first time. It should be at least somewhat familiar. So you have an idea of what has changed. So the first thing is it should be somewhat familiar to you. And as a writer, you should be able to express that, like with saying things like, "As the last time he was here, it felt like this." So when you're walking into it, like to me, I don't do the dark, turn off all the lights thing because that's a party favor kind of. That's a product. That's production value, I guess, because
Uh-huh.
to get the green. So you're gonna take into account what it was like the first time you've been there, and then as you go through there, you're going to almost have to go into a state of like hypervigilance.
Okay.
And so you need to be paying attention to your complete environment. And so you should take your time in there. So you should be looking for the way that you feel when you walk in there physically. Like, is your hair stand on end? Are you dealing with some kind of infrasound reaction? Do you want to run out of the building? You should pay attention to all those things. Like walking into an investigation the first time, everything needs to be recorded as well. I'm not talking maybe I would say write it down like an investigation. So to me,
Or
um,
like have a recorder and kind of speak your observations.
speak your observations, but make sure you're the only one speaking. So there's no pollution of the audio
Oh,
because that's the thing
I
that I
was
think.
thinking something else, like the ghost is hopefully leaving some notes and that notes you didn't intend to leave.
Well, and that's possible, but that's like if you get like an electronic voice phenomena, uh, you don't want to have multiple conversations going into the environment. So you couldn't be possibly like you have something you didn't hear, but it's the guy in the next room talking.
Okay.
So you have to like you have to really be aware of where people are. And like if you are on the recorder saying, Bob and Jill are in the next room over. So I should be the only voice on here, but if not, we'll have to eliminate. The environment. You have to record the whole environment. So hyper alert, hyper
Gotcha.
aware of the, and don't turn off the lights so you can see, because if this stuff is real, you're not going to need to have it be dark to experience it.
What if you're a beginner and you're just spooking yourself? How can you trust some of those like shivers and chills?
You can't. I mean, I'm in the brutal, honest answer is you can't. You can't trust it. That's why you need to kind of already be familiar with the area. And there are a lot of people, I believe, psych themselves out and they scare themselves. And I think that's a big part of why a lot of people do paranormal investigations. I probably shouldn't say that too much, but
It's a little bit of it's exciting.
it's exciting. And I think it's a different way to explore your own spirituality too. Because if you're starting to answer the question if is there life after death, and if there's ghosts, then I mean that's a spiritual experience as much as it is anything else. I think even maybe more so.
So you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but kind of revisiting it here, when we are arriving at this, let's call it a haunted house, a haunted school, an abandoned building, what is your goal in that initial investigation? Are you just there to document? Are you hoping to contact? Walk me through that.
So for me personally, I think the first is to document, to understand what the environment offers without interacting with the environment itself. And if you go back and then because there is like kind of a positive result, and
Mhm.
you feel it requires further investigation, that's when you might start to try and engage with whatever you feel is there.
Okay. And I see this in all the TV shows, they all have these tools, whether it's temperature readings or, I don't know, conducting a seance. So what tools have you used? What's your experience?
So my experience is initially I went in with the EMF detector, the audio recorders, cameras, and over time that really shifted for me, because one of the things I began to understand that the evidence that anyone's going to ever pull from an investigation is never going to be enough to prove to a skeptic
Okay.
that there is afterlife existence, or that the ghost exists, or anything like that. So really, at some point, the investigation becomes about what the investigator is seeking. So I would always go in with a pad of paper and a pencil, and my own senses being alert, and usually would bring an audio recorder just in case,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing more than that, because I feel
Okay.
like all the other tools are they're no different. I know everyone likes their little gadgets, and I don't want to decry them too much, but I don't feel like they're any more evidentiary than the anecdotes that you carry out yourself.
Okay. Like your own senses too, being able to work
Yeah,
with those. Gotcha. And have you ever been in a seance?
I have.
Yeah. How did that go?
Yeah,
Did you manage
it was
that or
great.
were you just like a guest?
So I it was for my former radio show slash podcast, The Grand Arc Conspiracy. It was a Halloween special. I had a former guest of the show. She was psychic, and she came up from Florida to Ohio, and she conducted the seance for us live, and we streamed it on video. It was very interesting because it was a lot of back and forth between the listeners on through the chat room and her herself, and so she would call something out, and there was people at the table holding hands. We had the candles, kind of try to set the whole vibe, if you will, a little spooky, but it was a lot of fun. And I still don't know where I stand on it, because I was so engaged with making sure that everything ran properly that I wasn't really sitting at the table.
Okay. Oh, bummer. It's kind of like when you run the technical for any show and you don't really get to enjoy it.
Right. I mean, I was engaged in it, at the beginning at the outset, but once it got rolling, it was more of like making sure that the chat room was being communicated. It was making sure that the video was still good, and the audio was still carrying through. So but it was an exciting night. And I know a lot of people, the people who came over to my house at the time and sat at the table, they all had a heck of a time. So I considered it a success, but I couldn't really speak too much to like the feels of it, because I was so hyper focused on pulling off the show itself.
I guess if you're very hyper focused on projects, ghosts can't get through. I always think like if you're a writer and you're like hyper focused on your project and there's a ghost in the background, you have no idea because your brain's just not open to that right now.
Right. Well, and I think that's a large part of what how people experiences are. They have to almost be open to even having the experience. Otherwise, you're going to walk right by it, because I feel like it's a lot more subtle than just like you said. They're kind of standing behind you. You might not notice them if you're not focused on it.
What is the most eerie experience that you've had that you couldn't quite explain?
That's a loaded question. You want a long story or a short story?
Whatever's entertaining.
So all right. I'll share kind of probably one of the creepiest ones that I've ever experienced, and this is why I'm a believer in the paranormal. A big part of the reason why I went over to a friend's house, and this was maybe in third grade, to spend the night. Third, fourth grade. I don't remember exactly the age that I was, but they would always joke about how their house was haunted, and how they had a friendly ghost, and how it would shut off the lights, or it would turn off channels, kind of like I described earlier I would do. It came time to go to bed, and this was an older house. And so we went upstairs, and his bedroom actually connected to his sister's bedroom. So, like, there was like a split in half. Her door was at the back of his room. So we're laying there, and he's already snoring. I'm in my Hawaiian punch sleeping bag.
Oh.
Um, and her door is open, and there was like a window directly behind it, and I could see like the light from the moon shining through it, and I see like a female form step in front of the window. And I'm like, oh, it's just a sister. But then at that point, I remembered, oh, wait, his sister's staying the night at one of her friend's house. Her sister's not in that room.
Ooh.
So as I'm laying there, I'm like, now I'm a little scared. It starts moving towards me, the shape. And I'm sorry, this one still gets to me.
Ooh,
As I'm
yeah.
laying, as I'm laying there, this form like climbs on top of me in my sleeping bag, and uh, and this is going to sound so crazy, but I'm going to go ahead and go for it. I remember looking at it in the face, and it had like yellow skin. It was like almost looked like parchment, and the eyes were sewn shut, and the mouth was sewn shut, and it had no nose. It just had the nasal cavities,
Ooh.
and I passed out.
Oh,
And when I woke up,
did your friend ever like describe that to you before?
no, I'm gonna put this way: I lived a kind of sheltered life. I wasn't exposed to like horror films or movies or anything like that till even after this, maybe 12, 13 years old. And so I was probably like 9 or 10.
A full
So
disclosure, by the way, as you're telling me this story, I'm in a dark room and I'm like opening the window blinds.
yeah,
I'm like, let's get some light in here. Anyway, keep going.
so I mean, I literally passed out from fear, and when I woke up, whatever was gone.
Oh.
But like it still bothers me, and that was something that happened like decades ago. That one, yeah, I'm shaking right now telling you.
Oh gosh. Well, that reminds me of, especially when it's almost like your brain has to be open to it and you're talking about how you saw it, and after you saw it, it's almost like it notices you. It makes me think of, I've heard, and I mentioned this in another podcast, I think, where nurses, doctors that work in hospitals where there's a lot of death and like night shifts, they'll see or hear something. And a lot of like people who come new and they go like, I think there's someone in that room, and they're like, don't look at them. And they don't talk about them, don't acknowledge them, because it's like giving them attention gives them something to focus on or purpose, I guess. And what they want them to do is move on, because according to what I'm hearing from nurse ghost talk or whatever on TikTok, is
Uh,
these spirits may not know that they're dead. And so they're just hanging around. And so if you ignore them, they'll move on. And so then it makes me think that you saw this thing. And so that's why it came to you, kind of thing. Whereas if you didn't notice it, maybe it would never bothered you. I don't know.
what's interesting to me, like looking back on it from a more pragmatic standpoint, is the fact that the whole family thought the house was haunted, and they thought it was this ha ha goofy little thing. And for me, it was completely not goofy. Like one of the things that, again, when I go back to the psychological bent, that I notice, like when I'm listening to someone tell a story, or if I'm in person watching them tell the story, is the kind of response that they physically manifest as they tell the story. Because it's like if they offer like a true trauma response, like the shaking, the adrenaline, the hair, the struggling to tell, the eyes looking upward, then you kind of know like whether or not it actually happened.
Mm.
It is part of their own personal experience,
Ooh.
because there is still a trauma response happening there.
So when you're doing your investigations, do you usually have the client with you, or do you go alone?
I would always, whenever you can be alone, be alone. As long as you've got recording devices, you can kind of back up what you're doing. I mean, maybe you want to partner up, but you don't want the client there, because they're going to kind of cloud your own view of what's potentially happened.
Okay.
Because you're your own instrument in a way. You're your own measuring device. And when you start adding people into an experience, that shifts what that those measurements will be, because you're going to look for other people's um, response to measure your own against, rather than just taking it at face value for yourself.
There are some belief systems that by engaging, you're inviting. So, was there ever a worry or concern or experience where you felt like by engaging and entering these places that you're going to take some of it home with you, or it's going to latch onto you, kind of thing?
I think that's always a concern when you engage anything. I don't want to sound too hokey, but anything spiritually, is that especially that could be potentially negative, is that you're going to carry that weight with you back to where you came from. And in some regards, you almost always will. I know a lot of people, yeah, I know you're talking about entities following you home, and I know a lot of investigators who have had claim to have had that happen. Um, it's never been a huge concern for me, because I guess I've dealt with this pretty much my whole life, and I have figured out a way to kind of close that off.
Kind of like set a boundary, right? Where you don't want
Yeah,
toxic
yeah.
people in your life. You're like, all right, ghosts, toxic spirits, I'm not here for you. And then maybe they'll listen.
Yeah, well, and who knows? I mean, who knows what's actually out there on the other side, which I think is something a lot of people don't even like to think about. Like, if there is another side and you're engaging with these, and
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, so you described one interaction with this thing
because
that
you
was.
really have, yeah.
Oh,
So
I think
that's
I
where I
lost
think this.
you. So sorry. I think you went dark. Can you say what the last
Uh
thing was?
oh,
Yeah.
okay, sorry.
No, it's fine.
So I think when you're dealing with these energies, you never really know what you're seeing on the other side, because it's not like you can visualize them, or if they are as ephemeral and mystical as they would need to be, they only have to show you the image they want to show you. So you will never know the true nature of what you're dealing with.
Oh, spooky. And you won't know until you're there. Like
Right? Yeah,
passed
yeah,
over.
yeah, exactly. And I guess that's why, as a writer, it's why another thing that intrigues me about it is that that is definitely something, since it's an unknown, that you have a lot of leeway to play with.
So you've discussed one type of interaction when you were a kid. What other types of interactions can writers explore with their characters that you've experienced?
Well, let me think about that. Right. So another, I mean, obviously just the investigation and the personalities. Like, if you are on like a team, like, you can create a team around it. I mean, and then the exploring the personalities and how they interact with that. Also, it's an interesting way that you can explore reality itself, the way people differ in the way that they perceive reality.
Okay.
So I think that would be a really, and that's something I've done myself, like, in my writing, is explored the different perceptions of reality, and how a singular event can kind of shift it from one way to another.
What are the different ways a presence or a spirit or whatever make themselves known aside from just lurking in doorways and that scary thing that happened to you?
Well, I mean, like, we talked a little bit about the cold spots. I mean, I suppose that that's possible. And of course, there's olfactory, uh, which is, the smells, is another way that a lot of people think that they do. Um, you know, Amorphous shapes, whether that's mist or shadows. 'Cause I know there's a lot of talk about shadow people. Um, they always typically, they are a little bit like, they're humanoid, but they're not completely humanoid. So, and I know apparitions are pretty uncommon. Auditory is another way, whether that's disembodied voices, or if you're a believer in electronic voice phenomena, that's another way they could potentially communicate. And also moving objects. So there's a lot of ways that, at least people that have done paranormal investigations have experienced, uh, you know ghost, I guess, for lack of a better term.
You mentioned shadow people, humanoids. Does that apply to animals? Shadow animals?
That is definitely a thing that a lot of people have reported, that they see shadow animals, and it's become more common. And I don't know if you're familiar with the mythology of thought forms. I'm trying to think what they're called. Are you familiar with the play Harvey?
Mm-mm.
It's like a puka, I think is what it's called. And it's a thought form that's brought into existence as an individual entity by the people who are thinking about it.
Ooh.
Um,
The reason why I
Go ahead.
ask is because that's something I've encountered as a child. So I
Really?
had, yeah, my childhood home, my brother and I would experience so many weird shadow things. So, the most common thing that we kept doing was we kept mistaking them for our dogs, and then we would go follow it, and then turn the corner, and there's nothing there, and we turn around, our dogs on the opposite side of the house. That happened to us multiple times, and then there'd be times where I'd be in bed at night, and I would just get a really freaked out feeling. And because even though like the room was dark, there was a corner of the room like right in front of my bed actually where it was just darker than the rest of the room. Like, and I don't mean naturally darker. I mean like for some reason I couldn't see. I could see, and you know when your eyes adjust to the dark, it's not
Hmm.
completely black. I could see everything in my room, but there was a spot across the room for me I couldn't see through. And that would happen like every now and then. It would just happen like routinely to the point where I was like scared of my room and all that stuff. And then when we moved out, I never had that problem again. It was just in my childhood house.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That's why I'm like I'm a little interested in this in these shadowy
I,
creature things.
that's a very interesting. I mean, because I don't want to say what I'm thinking,
Mm.
because, but I'm going to. Uh,
Is it gonna follow
you
me
know,
if you say it? Is it gonna
no,
follow? Okay.
no. I think whatever was is that would sounds almost more nefarious than just your run of the mill.
Ugh.
Um, it sounds like a presentation to bring familiarity and comfort before it does its real
Yuck.
intent.
Yuck.
So it's animals. You're familiar with animals. You're not as scared of animals, but it's really this. I mean, in a lot of literature that I've read, that's a that's a common, more on the dark side of things, story.
Interesting. Well, now when my daughters get spooked about things, they're like, what if I see something? I'm like, you punch it in the face. Like I'm like, because I grew up so freaked out, but I'm like, just punch it in the face, and like show some aggression and maybe you'll be fine. Is that
Well, I
good
mean,
advice? Would you tell people that?
it's better than a fear response. Let's put it that way, because, like I said, I don't want to get too much into my. I've had experiences where, yeah, I pretty much was like dealing with things, and when I stopped responding in a fear response and basically just stood up to basically what it felt to me tantamount to a bully, uh, it stopped.
Okay. I
So
will
that's
keep
great
telling
advice.
I'll keep telling them that. I mean, the worst that could happen is they accidentally punch each other. If like one's
Right.
walking into the other room. But
I
I
mean,
mean, hey.
the real advice is, yeah, don't get scared and don't engage.
Okay. Yeah. Whenever I would get that nighttime fear, I would like hide. I would just like hide under the covers and just wait. And then it wouldn't always stick around. Like eventually it would kind of fade away. It wasn't like this thing that just stayed there forever, but it was just I could always tell when something just seemed a little wrong in the corner, and I've never felt that way anywhere else again, like after moving out of there.
So what was that feeling like? Was it like a sinking feeling? Was it a tightness in your chest? Was it a
It was
gut
that, and then I
feeling?
got really hot. Like my body would get really
Mm,
hot. I would get a sinking feeling, like a dread tightness, and then I'd be afraid to breathe. I'd be afraid to move. And
almost
so,
suffocating. Hmm.
yeah, it didn't help to have the blanket over me because I felt like I couldn't. It made it worse. Um, yeah. And then the dog thing, it felt more like a fluke, like a mental fluke, until my brother and I talked. And he's like, Vickie, he's like, I would see that too. And he's like, one time I thought one of our dogs went into my bedroom. I followed it into my bedroom, looked in my bedroom was empty. I turned around and both our dogs were at the top of the stairs looking down at me. Like, and he's like, so what went into my bedroom? And I'm like, oh God.
Yeah, well, that sounds like, I mean, I have a similar story. I went to do an investigation and there was three of us in the car. We're pulling up to the gates of this cemetery. It's just like starting to get dark, so my headlights were on. I saw something cut my headlights and like leap onto the hood of my car. And I just like, it startled me and I just stuck my head down on the steering wheel and I put my head back up. It was gone. Didn't say anything. Look over the person next to me and they're like, did you just see that? And the other person chimed in, you know, so it's like we all three saw it, but nobody said anything initially. So it's one of
Mm,
those things like where, okay, I'm not so crazy because I wasn't going to say anything. I think I'm okay. This is just me, you know, expecting to see something, but they all described the exact same thing.
oh,
So it's kind of like your dog story. Like you didn't discuss it, and when you came and it was the
mhm.
same, it kind of, I don't know, it kind of affirms, you know, that your experience.
Yeah. Okay, so then getting back to your investigation process, how do you know you can close out an investigation? What do you do?
I mean, if it's an investigation that's really just exploratory, then it's just whenever I feel like I've got the answer I was looking to get, like whether it's this place haunted or this place is, that's kind of your exploratory thing. If you are dealing with people that you've given them the answers that you can give them, and you see that they're empowered enough to lose the fear and to no longer engage it, I think you're good. So it's more of an education where they are on the lines of an education. I know one of the properties that we went to maybe 4 or 5 times.
Wow.
You know,
Okay.
and most of it's one time and out, but you know, sometimes you just need to help. It's more about guiding people out of fear than it is maybe proving to them that they're not crazy. I mean, I guess that's part of it because I think that's a really sane response to seeing something that doesn't match what we have in our day-to-day life, something that doesn't fall within how we understand the natural order.
Is there like an additional complexity when you're working with like the Catholic Church, for example, when there's and they have like a demonologist and all that stuff that you have to take into consideration compared to like, I don't know, I contacted you and wanted you to investigate my childhood haunted house.
No, there definitely is. So I didn't get so how that worked. They contacted me because they wanted to save the expense of having to travel from the New England area to Ohio. They knew I was in the area. They knew I was friends with the person. They knew I was trustworthy, and they gave me this whole set of instructions. I had paperwork I had to go with. I had to set up an appointment with the people, and then it was dealing and I hate to say it, the situation ended up really badly. And but they did their, you know, I recorded the interview, and then I had these questionnaires that needed to be filled out. So it was a lot more formal. I mean, it was almost downright bureaucratic,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that's the way it has to be. And the people I talked to, they they were not dealing with the demonic. It was psychological. The person was claiming to be oppressed and by a demon had basically, I think, Googled whatever demon name they could find, found out a lot about the past. It was several suicide attempts, manic depressive bipolar disorder, um, ended up in a mental institution, and then several years later did end up committing suicide. So that was a really sad situation
Mm-hmm.
because uh, what the demonologist did was tried to find her psychological help but because of the audio recording and because of the questionnaire was he was able to kind of weed out any kind of paranormal activity at all. But it was wasn't a fun phone call that when I got the news,
Wow.
because I interacted with those people. I cared about what happened to them.
Hmm. Do you find that pop culture interpretations of paranormal investigations has an impact on your work or the people you work with?
Oh, it definitely does. I mean, I think everybody has, unless you're doing paranormal investigation, you have a viewpoint of that it's all exciting, and there are times of excitement, but it's like any kind of investigatory work. There's more work spent in books. There's more work just looking at stuff. There's a lot of hours to get that 3 or 4 minutes of excitement um, or whatever you would call it to of success. So in pop culture, if you're going to take a paranormal bent, you're going to have to up the stakes, because the paranormal reality is most people aren't, Arnold Schwarzenegger fighting the devil in a Catholic church and end of days.
Hmm.
It's that's just not going to happen. So I don't think the stakes are the same. So as you're writing, you kind of need to up the stakes a little bit. And I think pop culture has kind of really fed that, because most of the horror films don't take a subtle approach. There needs to be like threat to life, and I don't think even the nefarious stuff always plays out that way.
Is there a movie or book that you think gets it the most right?
That's a good question. Books. I mean, if you read the I think it's William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. It's pretty good. I think that's a good book. Movies, I would say Session Nine. I don't know if a lot of people aren't familiar with that movie,
Okay.
but that one is very subtle, and you really don't get introduced to any kind of paranormal element until it's I almost want to say until it's too late.
Ooh.
You don't even realize what's happening until it unravels.
Is it on Netflix? Do you know where people can see it?
I don't know if it's on Netflix. I don't know.
Okay.
It's kind of a more obscure movie. I want to say it was made in the early 2000s. I don't know where people can stream it, but that is one that I think is kind of really on the nose.
Session 8 is called.
Session Nine.
Session 9. Oh, okay. I wonder what session 8 was. What advice do you have for writers who are interested in writing about paranormal investigation? You touched on some, but if you have any more.
So, I mean, it depends on how you want to approach paranormal investigation. If you want to be like ghost hunters or ghost adventures, I mean, you just kind of write what you see on TV. If you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of the couple hundred years of psychical research that's been out there, do some research. Find some guys like Dr. Barry Taff, Lloyd Auerbach. Those are some good guys that are working in the field now. A good friend of mine, Brian Parsons, he's got a few books out there that are very like kind of pragmatic. They're not so sensationalistic. So you'll get a more realistic viewpoint on what it means to be a paranormal investigator, and of course, go out and investigate yourself. Um, I know that that's a good way to kind of get a sense on what those environments are going to feel like. But if you do go out and investigate yourself, always make sure that you have permission to be where you are, because you don't need to be trespassing. You don't need to deal with that.
Mm.
Any of the negative consequences of doing that. I mean, so if you want to get that in there, I think those are a few good points to begin to understand the topic a little more intellectually.
Have you ever written about have you ever turned your encounters into a book or a story? Can you do that?
My
Are there
encounter,
privacy stuff that you have to think about?
um, no, because I think you can just change the names and locations, and that would take care of that. I don't. It kind of seeps into my fiction. I don't think I'm too interested in writing a nonfiction book on the topic. But I mean, I do kind of work that stuff into the fiction work that I've been doing, because it's part and parcel of who I am personally. So I mean, I think any writer is going to put a lot of themselves into the words that they put together.
So when you're establishing like your traditional protagonist or antagonist for a paranormal investigation type story, Who are some good, like, is it always the ghost that's the antagonist? Could it be the humans? What are your thoughts on that?
So the one I'm currently going through the editing process, and hopefully will be out, yeah, early 2024. Um, the protagonist is not a ghost, and the antagonist is not a ghost. But the thing that brings them together is a spirit, is
Mm.
spirits or ghosts. So I think they, while ghosts can be interesting, and even the book that I have coming out this fall, there are ghosts in it, but it's not central to it's central to the plot, but it's not part central to the character development, so to speak.
Mhm.
It's not a main character. So I feel like when I write with ghosts, it's the ghosts really aren't the story so much as they are a way to drive the story forward. Because I feel like, not that you can't do that, but for my writing, that it's the humans that make the difference.
Okay.
And
Well, that's also like great morality stories too. Like focusing on humans and not always making the ghost the enemy because we can be our own enemy.
I feel that. I mean, I think that's the biggest monster that we have out there is us, our is mankind, is humankind. Um, I think we have capacity to be angels and demons, and so that's what I'm more interested in exploring. And how we illuminate that, I guess, is how I use the ghosts and the paranormal things in my books.
So this has been such a great discussion. You've actually kind of fired up my interest in one of my manuscripts that I had to shelve for a while because the human side of that story was getting to me, but I had a great joy in writing the paranormal side of it. So you've been inspiring me to pick that project back up and see if I can fix it. I could probably go on forever on this topic, but I wanted to get to our listener submitted questions. So I put out a question on Instagram and had people submit, and I've got a good handful. So you ready to go through them?
I'm ready. Shoot.
Okay. What scale do you use for detecting psychokinetic energy readings?
I don't. I use my own gut.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't use equipment. I guess once again, I can answer that pretty quickly. When I first started doing the podcast, one of the purposes I did for the podcast was to get audio to do a documentary, because after investigating for a while, I realized that the tools that people are using aren't any different than Ouija boards or table knocking that they did back in the early 20th and late 19th century. So I thought that they weren't really scientific, other than the fact that they were just updated techno gadgets.
Okay. And that's still your gut is probably the strongest measuring device.
That is the strongest measuring device.
Okay. Kind of like when I just had that sinking feeling for no, like, and freaked
Absolutely.
out. Okay. To what extent do you believe ghosts are conscious or aware of the living/physical world?
That's a loaded question. Now, see, that one is, are they sentient or are they not? And I think it's a mixture. I think environment is a huge part of when we get repeating apparitions that don't interact. But when a person is reporting a haunting, typically it's not one of those things. The environment is interacting in ways that are anomalous and aren't easy to record. So I would say it's a strong combination of both of those possibilities. I would say probably it's a 40% residual, and 60% sentient.
Interesting. In my manuscript, I work in government, so I thought it'd be kind of fun to apply the bureaucracy to paranormal investigations. And I created levels and in this case, the ghosts are the patient instead of the victim. And I had levels for like how sentient they were and how self-aware they were, and it could be based off of what they were like as humans. So if you are a psychopath, toxic individual, you're more likely to come back as like a toxic psychopathic presence versus someone who maybe died peacefully and now they're just kind of blissfully unaware floating through the afterlife or whatever. That was kind of how I approached it. It sounds like the existence of a range I might have gotten.
I think you're probably correct. And I think another thing interesting to play off of that you could do is to think like how much of that was their biochemistry, like altering their personalities, and what happens to them when they're kind of free of that. Are they still like the psychopath, or are they now a milder version of it? Now they're just kind of a jerk, like.
Oh, that's a really good point. Okay.
So it's like,
What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
it was just a thought, like when you're saying that. That's an interesting idea.
Okay, next question. Are ghosts this might be a little bit more philosophical, but are ghosts experiencing what is commonly thought of as an afterlife, or does their existence as a ghost mean they are not experiencing the afterlife?
That's a really interesting question. I think the fact that they're a disembodied consciousness would suggest that they're experiencing an afterlife, but it might not be the one that they anticipated. Or if there is a fact like a passing on or a moving on, or however you want to call it, to the next realm, that they're kind of trapped in between, a limbo state. I still say they're engaged in an afterlife, but they're not experiencing the uh, next stage, so to speak, that they're still kind of trapped here instead of moving into the next dimension.
Gotcha. Can everyone become a ghost or only certain people or belief
I would
systems?
think, wow, that's a good question as well. But I think that unless there is no soul, then yes, the answer would be everyone can become spirit, or is spirit experiencing through a physical body, and then they're released from the physical body. So the answer to that would be everyone or no one.
Okay. So then can animals or non-human, are there animal and non-human ghosts?
I believe that animals have souls. So the answer to that would be yes, there should be. If they have a soul, then they should be able to continue into the next stage of existence.
That got me thinking, like how many interactions reported to you are dream based?
Well, yeah, I mean, because you, it's a very real possibility. Because I think I don't know what the statistics are on it, but like engaging, a lot of reports do come when people seem to be going to bed, so they could be like coming from the hypnagogic state right before actually going to sleep. I mean, that's like, I don't know if you're familiar with the old hag syndrome.
Mm-mm.
So it's a thing that a lot of people report, is that old hag comes to them right before they fall asleep and holds them down, and like basically suffocates them and terrifies them right before they fall asleep.
Is that the same as the idea that
It,
they wake up and they're frozen?
yeah, and they
Okay.
can't move. That's the other thing. Yeah, so it's
Mm.
sleep paralysis comes along with that, but it's
Yeah.
usually, yeah.
Okay.
So that's, they call it the old hag syndrome, and that's definitely a nice terrifying thing to look into.
How do you rule out mundane explanations?
By testing the mundane explanations, because they should be repeatable.
Okay.
And so, like, if you can, it's like we talked earlier about the wood and it being humid, and the fragrance trapped in the wood being released from the wood. That you could probably, every time it's humid, you could probably go in there and smell that cherry pipe smoke. And that's what everyone's reporting. Or if you go to the Ohio State Reformatory, everyone reports smelling rose perfume on the staircase. Well, you've got all this uh, plaster around that wall, and if you had somebody spraying rose perfume there on that hallway, then it's trapped there until the right environmental conditions release it.
Interesting. And then the final submitted question, which was what makes the supernatural so intriguing?
It's the unknown. It's the unknowable. I mean, that's what makes it intriguing. If you experience something and it doesn't fit within, the accepted norms of what we understand as science, you don't know what it is, and so there's exploration that needs to be done. It's the same thing that push people across oceans or sends us to outer space, to the thirst for knowledge to understand the world with which we live in, and maybe exist beyond. That's why it's so intriguing. I mean, us as humans, we want to label and understand everything. Otherwise, it's scary. I guess the way I would couch that is, what if I told you there's a monster? It has 7 rows of razor sharp teeth. It can never stop moving or it dies. If you rub your hand the wrong way across its skin, it cuts you, and it can smell blood from a mile away. And that's a terrifying monster, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a shark.
Oh.
So understanding is a big part of how we remove the fear from the world we live in. And so that's where the intrigue comes in. Like, we don't understand ghosts. We don't understand the paranormal or the supernatural. And we're always struggling to find a way to put labels on it so it doesn't scare us as much. We don't know what happens when we die. So if we can figure out that there's ghosts, we understand that life persists, and we've answered a huge question for us. But can we ever know? I can't answer that, but the exploration of it is almost required for humans.
Well, Daniel, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much. You have educated me and also scared me, because I'm remembering you are the second person now to tell me that I may have been under some sort of attack as a child, because I had told that story to BB on a Crawl, who was on our Ghost Stories episode. I think she said the same thing.
Well, I mean, it's from a lot of the research and reading that I've done. I hate to say it. I apologize. I'm not trying to scare you.
Well, I made it out. Thank God. All right. Well, Daniel, any final remarks?
No, I want to say thank you very much for having me on. This has been an absolute blast for me. If anybody wants to find me, I'm on Instagram at dbautz. That's my handle. And if you want to look up my writing, it's all on Amazon. Just put in my name, Daniel Bautz.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.